tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. We have had some very exciting speakers for the lecture series, and I want you to know the sponsors, the co-sponsors of the Martin Luther King Lecture Series: the Afro-American Studies Department, the Du Bois Institute, the Center for International Affairs, and the Divinity School. We're especially proud this year that the John F. Kennedy School for Government joins us in sponsoring this lecture. This is the second lecture we have had in our 1982 series, and it is indeed my pleasure to welcome John E. Jacob, the president of the National Urban League. Mr. Jacob perhaps needs no introduction to this audience, but I think it is appropriate that you know a few things about him. He began his career with the Urban League movement in 1965 as the Director of Education and Youth Incentives at the Washington Urban League. He has held a number of administrative positions from 1968 until 1970, when he held post of acting executive director. Mr. Jacob has both his degree from Howard University, and he has been active in academic and intellectual communities since the early 1960s. He has been the executive vice president of the National Urban League and now oversees the over 118 affiliates of the National Urban League. Mr. Jacob readily accepted our invitation to be a Martin Luther King speaker, and I am certain he has some very important messages for us. It is indeed my pleasure to present to you John E. Jacob, President of the National League. Jacob?
Thank you, Nancy. I readily accepted this invitation for two reasons. One, I knew Martin and had a lot of respect. And when I was a graduate at Howard, we used to refer to this as the White Howard. And so I was happy to come in and visit the White Howard. I had the opportunity to join you today for a brief look at the situation of Black America and the nation. I'm happy to be here to share with you what I consider to be the responsibilities imposed on all of us. For the past 2 decades, I have been actively working for social change and civil rights. Never in that time has the state of Black America been more vulnerable. Never in that time has the state of Black America been so alienated from its government. Never in that time has Black people so strongly felt themselves under siege. Never in that time have Black economic and civil rights gains been under such powerful attack. And never in that time have Black Americans been so persistently pushed off the edge of the economy. Last month, the government released unemployment data that said 18% of Black workers were unemployed. 18%. And even that incredible figure underestimates the true extent of the depression in Black America. Those official figures don't count people who are forced to take part-time work when they have full-time bills. They don't count people who have given up the search for jobs that aren't there. They don't count people who never applied for jobs the president says are advertised in the newspapers since they can't operate computers. And they don't count people who won't follow the advice to move to the Sun Belt because those people know that Black unemployment in some of those booming states is 2 and 3 times that of the white rate. There are other parallel points that indicate the extent of continued Black disadvantage. Blacks are 10% of the labor force, 20% of the unemployed, and 40% of the discouraged workers. Almost half of all Black teenagers are unemployed, and that is according to official statistics. In some inner city neighborhoods, 3/4 of Black youths are jobless. 12% of Americans who are black make up a third of all Americans who live in poverty. Almost half of all black children live in poverty. The typical black family earns less than the government itself estimates is necessary for a minimum adequate standard of living. This new reality of deeper black hardship comes at a time when black people were beginning to make the kind of progress that would have put them firmly into the mainstream of our economy. Thanks to the very programs that are under the gun today, black people were gaining skills, jobs, education, and political power. The Voting Rights Act put black people into polling booths and helped elected officials to become black mayors, to become black sheriffs, to become mayors and sheriffs of communities that used to be solid Jim Crow counties. Medicaid helped to give poor black people access to health care. Food stamps cut hunger. CETA brought jobs. CETA brought income and training to poor people. Legal services gave poor people access to the courts. Affirmative action helped put qualified black people in training programs, factory workplaces, executive suites, and even in Ivy League colleges that had excluded them in the past. But Reaganomics has ended all of that. Instead, we have a supply-side theory that supplies more poverty, more unemployment, and more doors slammed in our faces. Virtually every piece of the president's economic program has a negative impact on the black poor. The president's plan to revive our economy includes tight money, less regulation, deep tax cuts, and heavy budget cuts. Tight money means high interest rates and more unemployment. It is largely responsible for today's deepening recession. Less regulation includes less civil rights enforcement, which means blacks are shoved to the end of the line. The tax cuts went to business and affluent individuals. Poor people got budget cuts and programs that helped them. Not just the black poor, and I want to be clear about that. Let's remember that there are more whites than blacks on welfare. There are more whites than blacks receiving food stamps. There are more whites than blacks benefiting from all of the major social service and income transfer programs. The new reality of Reaganomics is a radical, not a conservative reality. And since some of my best friends are conservatives, I want to be clear about that. True conservatism seeks to conserve the best of the past. True conservatism respects constitutional rights. True conservatism demonstrates the quality so visibly missing from Reaganomics, the quality of compassion. The new realities I have discussed affects all of us. They will dominate the prospect for national progress throughout the rest of this decade. They impose new responsibilities on all Americans, white and black, and they impose special responsibilities on the private sector and on the voluntary sector. I firmly believe that white Americans have a responsibility to recapture the spirit of decency so many demonstrated during the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. I believe there is a huge reservoir of support for equal opportunity, for an end to discrimination, and for an open, pluralistic, integrated society. I believe the time has come for decent people to tell their representatives they don't want holes drilled in the safety net of the poor, and that they do want actions that make ours a more equal society. And I believe the time has come for decent people to become involved in bettering race relations and helping people in need. We need white allies who will volunteer for community improvement activities, who will help make desegregated schools work, who will give the time and energy to efforts that will make society work for others as it has worked so well for them. It is time for caring white people to take on the new responsibility of addressing the vital survival needs of the poor. And there are also new responsibilities for the private sector. John F. Kennedy once said, "Of those to whom much is given, much is required." No one can deny that much has been given to America's private sector. It was the prime beneficiary of the administration's tax cuts, just as the poor were the prime losers. But with those benefits comes the responsibility to provide jobs, job training opportunities, and other opportunities for the disadvantaged, and to support community-based institutions that serve the needs of the poor. With many honorable exceptions, the private sector has failed to do this in the past. Most companies needed the club of affirmative action mandates to hire and promote minorities in any significant numbers. And even periods of federal activism and the threat of court suits have still not resulted in black economic parity. The new realities suggest new responsibilities for the private sector, and the public expects business to invest in job creation. It expects it to earmark some of its tax breaks to helping the poor. The administration backs private voluntary action to solve social problems, and the poor are turning to the private sector as the last resort to plug the gaps left by government withdrawal. Many national corporate leaders are saying that this may be the last chance for the private sector to demonstrate that it has the creativity and the sense of social responsibility to make our system work. So I am saying tonight that self-interest and compassion must drive the private sector to a heightened sense of responsibility in these terrible times for poor people. But I have also come here tonight to have a little talk with black folks, because I believe black people too have a new responsibility. In one small way, the hammer blows of Reaganomics may wind up being a blessing. For too long, we have pinned our hopes on good white people or the government to solve our problems. For too long, we have been defensive about problems within our own communities that we should be tackling ourselves. Now, I do not wish to be mistaken. Reaganomics is a terrible thing. Black people will never achieve equality without a government that protects our rights and provide the basic income, health, housing, and educational guarantees necessary for survival. We will never achieve equality without a private sector that actively draws us into the economic mainstream. But there are problems within our community, problems that we can and ought to do something about. There are problems within our community we must face directly and not excuse or be defensive about. Voting is an obvious one. Half of us don't bother to register. Half of those who register don't bother to vote. When we do vote, we make a difference. Just look at the 1976 presidential election or the mayoral elections of 1981 in Atlanta, in Miami, in Houston, or the gubernatorial race in Virginia in 1981. In 1980, we mounted an Operation Big Vote campaign at the 11th hour. No doubt we will have another such campaign in 1984. But why wait until then? Why not start now, right now, to get our communities registered and educate our young people on the power of the ballot? Martin Luther King is calling on us to do that. Teenage pregnancy is another community problem we must deal with. More than half of all black births are out of wedlock, and most of them are to teenagers. When babies have babies, the opportunities for both mother and child are restricted. The health of both are endangered. Even the warmth and support typical of black extended families is not enough to make up for the hardship that afflict female-headed households. We cannot ignore the fact that female-headed households are 5 times as likely to be poor as two-parent households. If we are to break the change of poverty that reaches across generations, we're going to have to fight for jobs, training, and child care opportunities for women. All of our community institutions will have to become involved in providing services to young mothers and services to their young children, whether it be counseling, educational assistance, job training, or other measures to help them and their babies make it in a hostile society. The black community must be concerned, not on a purely moral ground, but on the pragmatic ground that such families are at a double disadvantage in a society that limits opportunities for blacks and for women. We cannot sit back and allow the majority of the next generation to start life with two strikes against it. Nor can we accept the crime rates that afflict black neighborhoods. Now, I oppose the mentality that creates conditions that breed crime and then agitate for longer sentences and more prisons to warehouse society's victims. But neither can we tolerate the antisocial elements preying on our communities, making fear part of our lives and forcing our businesses to the wall. We as a community ought to be implementing neighborhood anti-crime measures and helping to keep our young people on the straight and narrow. There are many other problems afflicting black communities, from youth unemployment to education to housing. Most of them cannot be solved without government intervention and government resources, but many of them can be contained or at least made less critical by an involved black community. We as a people must take the responsibility to organize ourselves to deal with them. We can't leave them to the Urban League or other civil rights and social service groups. The problems are simply too big. We have new responsibilities as individuals and as members of our community. As individuals, it is up to us to see that our kids do their homework. It is up to us to monitor the schools, to monitor the health facilities, to become involved in the decisions that affect our lives and the lives of our families. And as a community, we have to mobilize our organizational strengths. The problems I've discussed, from lack of voting to crime in the street, should be addressed by our churches, our fraternities and sororities, our press, and our social clubs. Washington won't help us. The private sector doesn't know how to deal with those kind of internal problems. The community-based social service agencies cannot do it alone. That leaves us, black citizens, you and me, with the new responsibility of making an all-out effort to improve the lives of our neighbors and of our own community. And it leaves those among us who have the good fortune to hold decent jobs and attend prestigious universities with a special responsibility. It was the sit-ins of black students in the 50s that sparked the civil rights movement. It was the activism of the black students of the 1960s that helped us to win those victories. Today, all black people need the vitalism of a new generation of student activists. I believe today's privileged young people have a responsibility to work for community progress, not in just spouting rhetoric, not by picking up the latest fad in campus politics, not by fake fights on phony issues, but by real work in the community, by getting out the vote, by working with school kids to help them get into colleges too, by working with community groups trying to better people's lives, by using their knowledge and their skills to make ours a better community, and by building the coalitions with other groups that will pay off in positive social change. That's a lot harder than playing games and pretending to be militant. But it is a duty our hard-pressed community needs and expects. It is a challenge that was met by earlier generations of black students. It is a challenge today's generations must also meet. Black people have been helping each other survive ever since the days we came to this land in change. in the days of slavery, in the days of segregation, in the days of bright change and the nights of deep despair, we've been helping each other. If we know anything about black Americans, it is that we are, all of us, survivors. We've survived the hells of a past clogged with the tortured bones of our forebears. We've survived outrage after outrage. We've survived the fires of oppression and the flames of repression. We've survived. And we've survived because amidst the most terrible of the tragedies that ensnared us, we cared for each other. We fostered a spirit of pride and love that enabled us to overcome. And on that base of mutual respect and support, we marched and demonstrated and fought for our rights until this nation, embarrassed by its own betrayal of its ideals of equality and awed by our determination to overcome, said, yes, black people, you are right. The Constitution is for everyone. The Bill of Rights is for everyone. This country has a place for everyone, black and white. Everybody in America deserves a chance to make it on their own. Yes, it was black people that changed America. It was black people that joined hands with our white allies and helped turn this country around. And now it is up to black people to do it all over again. To remind America that if racism was wrong in the 1960s, racism is wrong today. If civil rights was right in the 1960s, civil rights is right today. If equal opportunity was right in the 1960s, equal opportunity is right today. So let us lift our voices and marshal our strength to help and nurture each other, to mute the pain and bring calm and compassion to those in need. Let us lift our voices to remind America that we have fought and died for it, that we want our rightful share of our national heritage in this land we help to build, in this land we love. Let us lift our voices to sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us, sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you.
A very powerful, powerful message. Mr. Jacob will welcome a few questions from the audience. Speechless. Yes.
The question, if I understand it correctly, is how can we attract better teachers to educational institutions, and how can we, what's the other part? Okay. Wow. Let me preface this by saying that I think if we ever solve the public school problem in Boston, we will solve the educational problem in this country, from what I read in the newspaper. I do believe, first and foremost, that black kids or inner city kids or kids who participate in public education cannot wait for the creation of new teachers. I think we have to make what we have there do what they are supposed to be doing. You know, it is very difficult for us who grew up in those old segregated, run-down, dilapidated, ill-equipped schools in the South to quite understand how in 1982 we cannot provide quality education for kids. I happen to believe, and that's part of what I was trying to suggest, that if they're not teaching it, then the people who can teach, whether they're teachers or not, got to go into the schools and help them to teach. I happen to believe that board people who are not seeing that public educational systems are doing what they ought to be doing have to be removed and people put in there who will see that it is done. I think that the 1980s demand that we be honest with the service delivery mechanisms that we have available to us. Now, I do believe that there are a lot of educated people sitting at homes who could assist in the public school setting. And I believe they have to leave their homes and go out and practice what I consider to be dirty medicine and get their hands dirty by dealing with these kids. The other thing I think we have to do is to say that we are not going to grant tax credits for private institutions. I think we got to come to grips with that. I think that that is going to do more to drain the public school system of the quality that it ought to have in dealing with the kind of people that we are talking about than anything that we have on the horizon today. And I think it is time for people who care to rise up in indignation and say that, Mr. President, that is not one strategy that you can have available to you to court the middle class to get their votes. You better find another one, because we will not buy into that one. Yes, sir. Where do I hope to take the Urban League? Well, let me begin by saying that the Urban League, since its very existence, has seen itself working around four basic principles: the principle of advocacy, the principle of service delivery, the principle of bridge building between the races, the principle of an open, pluralistic, integrated society. Those are unchanged and unchangeable principles. But I happen to believe that the decade of the 1980s demand more of service delivery for us, because that is where our constituency is hurting the most. The abandonment by government, the withdrawal of the programs from our constituency that they have come to depend upon for their basic survival needs. And I believe that the mandate for us in the 1980s is to work as hard as we can to undergird the poor and the disadvantaged by seeing that they get the services that they need to exist and survive, and hopefully to prevail in the climate in which they find themselves. Yes, ma'am. Well, the first thing that I try to do is to correct the myth that there is rising conservatism in the black community. Charles Hamilton, Wallace A. Sayre, professor at Columbia, did a piece for us in the State of Black America where he analyzed the black conservatism mood in the country. And what Chuck did was to trace conservatism among blacks along the continuum from liberal to conservative. And he validates, using not black data but Gallup data, to show that on social issues, black folks are very liberal. Now, on issues like crime, on issues like that, they are conservative. So first of all, there is not that rising tide, in my judgment, of black conservatism. The media has helped us to think that by putting 3 or 4 quote-unquote black conservatives on television, that there are a lot of them, but there are not a lot of them. But there are a few people around who happen to believe in Reaganomics and the Reagan policies. My answer to that is very simplistic. The black community has never been a monolithic community. It need not be a monolithic community. And we're big enough to allow for people to have differences of opinion. I happen to believe, however, that most black people, and indeed most white people, are coming on the scene to understand that what is being proposed is not in America's best interests, and it is not in their personal vested interests.
Mr. Jacobs.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question.
All right.
It's wonderful. I've seen a lot of, I'd like to say it this way. I've seen a lot of water going underneath the bridge. I stood there for quite a while. And I've heard a lot of rhetoric. Well, what we're going to do about crime and all like that. But I have seen nothing happen. Only more crime. Do you have a new idea that you implement so that we can work on crime?
Yeah, what I'm trying to get us to do is to organize our communities. I'm going to St. Louis next week because in St. Louis we have 250 block clubs organized. And I'm going out there to talk about how those block clubs can take that structure and put in their own protective mechanism. What we know about crime is that somebody knows who's doing it.
Yeah.
The people in those communities know who's doing it. And what we are faced with is that there is an alienation in our communities. While we have a concern about crime, we are also alienated from the institutions that ought to be doing something about crime.
Right.
What I'm trying to get us to do is to start doing some bridging between the institutions and the community, but to also get the community personally involved in providing its own security. If they see you stealing that man's television, you tell him. You tell him who took his television, and you go tell the people who ought to be doing something about who took the television, and you tell the taker that you're going to tell it. What I'm trying to suggest is that these are problems that the black community itself has to come to grips with. These are things that the black community itself must be willing to do something about. And I happen to believe that if we organize ourselves, we can do that.
Thank you very much. I agree with you on that. So what you are saying, that you're going to go to work and implement these.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Am I missing someone? Oh. Okay. Wherever. Yes. Okay. Sure. What is going to take to unite? A spark of unity is what you're talking about? You know what? I happen to believe, and I said that Ronald Reagan will probably do more to integrate us through poverty than anybody else has done to integrate us through affluence. What I have discovered, when you look at the data, there are some new phenomenons that are coming up on the horizon. We have always had the traditional unemployed. Unemployment for black folks has been running 22 to 25% for the past 3 or 4 years. The country became shocked when unemployment went to 10% for the broader American community. Now, a couple of things are happening, it seems to me. There are going to be an awful lot of unemployed, college-educated black people because we went to work in the public sector over the past decade. And they're going to be looking for some way to deal with that problem. There are a lot of unemployed white people, given the factory closed down, the auto industry, the railroad industry. I think for the first time in a significant period of time, there is a commonality of interests between the black middle class and the traditional poor that is centered around the vested interests of survival. And I believe that will provide us with the mechanism to come together, to mobilize, to address some of the problems of the 1980s. Yes, sir. Well, first of all, I think they ought to be trying to help the corporate sector to understand what it ought to be doing to facilitate and to help with some of these problems, and interpreting for the corporate community what it ought to be doing. But I also think that black folks have to start doing what white folks used to do, or still do, and do it very well, and that is to have a network to bring other folks in into the settings in which they find themselves. You know, Walter Fauntleroy, who's a friend of mine, said to me one day that when he was at Yale, can you use that word here at Harvard? Is that all right? Walter said when he was at Yale, he used to feel uneasy every time he saw another black student coming across the campus. And he said it took him a long time, but he finally realized that he liked being the only black at Yale. Now, the point that I want to make is that there are some black people who like being the only black in those corporations. And what I think we have to get them to understand is that they have to become a network for assisting black folks into accessing the mainstream America scene. The other thing, in my judgment, is that they bring a unique knowledge about how to deal with mainstream America. And they have to bring that knowledge back to community groups, community organizations, community institutions, so that the black community will know better how to deal with mainstream America. So I think that there is a very unique role that they play in dealing with what is going to happen in the decade of the 1980s. Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Well, frankly, I believe I don't believe black people have ever had it easy in this country under anybody. I think it has been a struggle for us under anybody. That's why we're not really shocked with Ronald Reagan. We hurting, but we're not shocked. The country is shocked, but we're not shocked. I mean, we believed him when he said he was not going to do this. I mean, we're not shocked. What I do think we have to understand is that we got to save us. We got to be very clear on accessing people who will help us, but we have to commit ourselves to saving ourselves. And in many instances, it is from ourselves that we have to save ourselves. But I think that we've had hard times in this country ever since we've been here, and we're likely to have them for a few years longer. But I happen to believe that if we continue to struggle, if we continue to fight, we will also prevail. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm a freshman in college, and along with some of my classmates, are faced with a decision now about the rest of our lives. This coming Monday, we have to hand in a choice of study. In other words, deciding what our major will be. And I'd like to hear from you what you feel is one of the areas that we as black people are missing educated college students as leaders that we can really affect some kind of very deep-seated change in.
Well, I think the first thing that in all candor, and I'm not being facetious, is that black people have to make sure that they get in fields that are going to provide job opportunity. That's the first thing, because a lot of black folks are in trouble because they went into areas that are being completely wiped out at this point in time. I mean, the jobs for the decade of the 1980s and into the year 2000 are high technology, telecommunication. I mean, we've looked at it, and that's where it is. But I believe that, having said that, that black folks have to strive for excellence. And I don't care where you end up. I don't care what field of study you go into. If you strive for excellence and succeed, there is a place for you in this country and in this movement. We need black young people who are bright, who are creative, who are energetic, and who are willing to take some risk. And I would suggest to you that you go where you want to go, but just do whatever you decide to do very, very well.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, sure. St. Louis is convenient because they're already organized. I mean, and so we want to take advantage of the fact that they are already out there, they're already organized. But what I'm suggesting is that the decade of the 1980s demand that we look inward into the black community for institutional strength in the black community, the black church. The black church has always been an institution in our community. Some work very effectively dealing with social problems and social concerns. Some do not. But the commitment, the mission is there. And what I'm suggesting is that we have to begin to provide the quote-unquote social service mechanism for black institutions to service the black community better. And I happen to believe that that is a role that we can play in the decade of the 1980s. Yes, sir. Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, you know, there's some misnomer around that we've always had government money. We didn't get government money until 1968. I mean, that is a new phenomenon. We were providing services long before government money came, and we provided it with people who cared. Now, you know, and I also, you know, I want to say a little bit about principal funding sources. I think organizations have to understand that the relationship they have with the United Way is a partnership. The relationship is that we agree to come together because you're going to do this and we're going to raise the money so you can do that. That is a partnership. If there are no agencies out there doing the job, there is no need to have a United Way raising money. And you got to help the United Way to understand that. That is how United Ways got created. They need to be brought back to understand that. But the reality is that I happen to believe that we are at a time in which people who care can come together and deal with problems. Secondly, I happen to believe people have to demand from government that it does what it's supposed to do. The new federalism, which I am completely opposed to, would suggest that problems can best be solved at the local level because it is the local level who best understands what the problems are. Now, I do believe that there is a role for government, and I believe we have to insist that government fulfill its role. It is the responsibility of government in a democratic, humane, civilized nation to promote the general welfare of all of her people. And if people are hungry, government got to be concerned about that. If people are unemployed, government got to be concerned about that, and we got to see that they are. And if we don't like it, we ought to get some new people in government. And that is why I suggest to you a critical piece of this program is citizenship education, voter registration, and getting people to the polls and voting so that you can get people in office who care about what your agenda is. Yes, sir. Well, you know, we have toyed around with the whole notion of economic development now for a while. Let me be the first to admit that we have not proven ourselves to be very good at it. I mean, that's honest. We have not proven ourselves to be very good at it. There are some people who are better at it than we are. And so I have put on the table that that is not our strong suit. What I am proposing, however, that there are some things that we can do. What we can do, in my judgment, is to raise the entrepreneurial literacy of black folks. There is a notion, in my judgment, among a lot of black people that you have to produce some kind of hardware to be in business. And I happen to believe that we are the best service providers in the country. And if we can get people to understand that you too can have a business if you want to take care of the maintenance of Harvard. If you want to do the cleaning of Harvard, there are a lot of folks who make a lot of money cleaning buildings. We clean them, they just make the money. And somehow we've got to help people to understand that they can also make the money. So what we're trying to do is to try to find some of these displaced government workers who have college degrees and are unemployed because they went to work at the Community Services Administration and they got cut when they closed the agency, to help them to understand that in a time in which government is talking about free enterprise, maybe we ought to talk about some free enterprise projects, some profit-making projects dealing with the drug problem. And we will counsel for a fee. We will provide education for a fee. We will do a number of services, but we will set up a business to do it so that we get an opportunity of not having to build a computer, but to do what we have demonstrated we are best at and educated to do, and that is to provide services to this country for a fee. Yes?
I was wondering if you could comment on how you think the Urban League, what role it plays in being a catalyst to influencing private corporations to invest in the black community. For example, Digital Corporation located a plant in Roxbury and has been a source of employment for black people in that area. And I was wondering how you view the Urban League as a catalyst in maybe having more corporations do this type of thing in other communities across the country.
Yeah, we are accused of having the best corporate contacts of any of the organizations in this business, and I suspect we do. And so what I'm doing as a part of all this is running around trying to convince corporate America that they ought to tell the truth about what their capabilities are, first of all, to this president that we have, and secondly, to make an investment in the black community. Some are doing it fairly well. IBM is one of those that tend to do it very well. I guess digital is another that tends to do it very well. I believe it's a marketing job, and I believe that we have to convince them to do it. But I also believe that we have to do something in the black community so that they will become less anxiety-ridden about coming in. If we're talking about crime is so bad in the black community that we don't want to be there, the truth of the matter is that no company is going to want to locate there, and that is one of the reasons why I believe we have to become concerned about the crime problem in our community so that we can attract people who can come into the community and do something about it. But we are trying to sell that notion right now. Yes, I see you. Okay. Yes, ma'am. What do I think the Reagan administration is doing to ease unemployment? I'm sorry. Oh, should be doing. Well, they could stop creating unemployment, the first thing that they could do. You know, the Reagan administration eliminated CETA. CETA provided a lot of jobs and a lot of job training to people in this country. And there is some crazy notion that CETA was a failure. In my judgment, it was not. There are a lot of people who are trained. There are a lot of people who were working because they went through the CETA program. I think the first thing that the president ought to do and the administration ought to do is to restore a program that makes sense in providing job training and job placement. Let me just take it a step further and say one of the things that the new proposal that for the program that is replacing CETA has in it is that it will not provide training stipends for people going through job training. And this administration has some feeling that that will therefore give them the truly motivated. Now, I have said to them that what that will give you are people who have an infrastructure that can support them while they spend 6 months in training. It has nothing to do with motivation, because people in training have to have some way to pay streetcar fare, a subway fare to get to the training. They got to be able to pay for the child care so that they'll have some place to leave their kids. So I think there are some very easy, fundamental things that could be done. One is to restore monies for training. One is to put stipends back in those training programs. And the other is to recognize that as a last resort, government has to do something in providing employment. It does not make sense. And let me just give you a couple of statistics. In 1981, there were 107 million people in the American civilian labor force. 98 million of those people were employed. 9 million were unemployed. Of that number, 13 million black people were in the civilian labor force. 11 million were employed. 2 million were unemployed. We therefore composed 12.1% of the labor force, 11.2% of the employed, but 22.3% of the unemployed. We had 2 million black people unemployed in 1981. Now, the point that I want to make is that many of those people were unemployed because they did not have the skills to deal with the complicated job opportunities that are available. I believe it is the responsibility of government to provide them with the opportunity to get the job training in order to perform the jobs that are at that level of performance. And the other thing that I think we ought to be clear about is that we tend to talk about the failure of programs like CETA and job training programs. What we do not recognize is that in the last 28 years in this country, we have had no less than 7 recessions. And we're in one now, and the economy, the malfunctioning of the economy has always been so unstable, always so volatile, that we have not been able to provide a sustained period of growth in order to accommodate the success of a program, be it government funded or any otherwise. So I think the first thing they have to do is to provide monies for job training, to provide monies for job placement, to provide jobs through programs like CETA or Job Corps or whatever as a last resort to provide employment for people. Yes, ma'am. You know, I think the first thing that we ought to do, and I'll take your question in a second, I think the first thing that we ought to do is to give everybody the White House telephone number. I really mean that. I'm really serious. I think we ought to give people the telephone number to the White House so they can call and get on the record about how they stand on programs and concerns affecting the people that we're talking about. They do look at those. They do look at those. And so I think we ought to do that. But I also believe that 1982 is a very critical year. I think we have to make all of those folks who want to go to Washington in 1983 tell us where they stand on the issues confronting poor and disadvantaged people in this country. And if we do not like their responses, we ought to find us somebody to go to Washington whose responses we do like. And I think 1982 is so critical because it will send the message to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue as to what we really expect from them in the next 2 years. So you got to go out and vote in 1982, and you got to take everybody you know out to vote, and you got to make the people who are running say where they stand on the issues and make sure they stand where you think they ought to stand. The other thing, I think that we have to make sure that local government does what it is supposed to do. Now, there's no question. Block grants are here. And local governments have money to provide programs if that is what they want to do. I think we have to tell the mayors. I think we have to tell the city councils. But more importantly, I think we have to get on some of those boards and commissions that define for local government what it ought to be doing and define in the interests of the poor and the disadvantaged. Yes, sir.
I was wondering about the coordination of your efforts between other black organizations like SCLC and NAACP. It seems like, if there was any kind of event, as far as if there was a planned effort or coordination between your groups, it seemed like you could affect change a lot better. And I as far as I've worked for several different organizations, and I kind of feel like which camp should I go with, as far as my efforts and times. I was wondering about as far as your working relationships.
Okay, the first thing is that it doesn't matter which camp you go to, just go. I mean, go somewhere. I mean, that's the first thing. But secondly, and I'm not being flippant with you, I don't intend to do that. I think the other thing, though, is that there is an awful lot of interacting, certainly at the national level, between all of the groups. We have a Black Leadership Forum. We meet almost monthly. But, I happen to believe that the best plans are the ones you do not share with the public. And, people keep it's only in the civil rights community that everybody wants you to tell them what the plan is. And I keep saying that this is no football game where at halftime you go and tell whether you're going to run the next half or pass. I mean, this is a war, and that you do not share the plans of the war. But suffice it to say that we get together often. We meet often. Ben and Jesse and Joe Lowry and me and Carl Holman and Julius Chambers and Dorothy Hyatt and Leon Sullivan going to have a meeting on March 18th, and we're going to talk about what we ought to be doing together, what we ought to be doing together and separately and individually. And we decide what are those things that we can do together. And there are things that we cannot do together, and we decide we can't do them together. But we also decide to not get in each other's way as we enter into the process of trying to do them. But I am serious in the sense that I do believe it is important for black people to hook on someplace. I'd love to have you in the Urban League, but if you don't come there, go for Jesse, or go for Ben, or go for Joe. Go someplace, because ultimately what makes the difference is that you get counted.
On that note, may we say thank you to Mr. Jacob.